My God, if this information is true, then this is absolutely stunning. That means that Ted Cruz is Charity Crouse. And I heard that after September 11th in 2001, Charity Crouse created a webpage where she was discussing the Office of Homeland Security. And one of the things she did is she listed America's 10 most wanted terrorists. And I don't remember all 10 of the people she listed, but she listed Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Tommy Thompson, a couple of other people. And she pretty much, on one level or another, spent the next 18 years trying in one way or another to tear a bunch of other stuff she was investigating to proving that they were actually domestic terrorists. And part of the reason she had to do this is because on that site, she had two agents, Anon and Emus. They were two agents of the Office of Homeland Security. So it was one of those things that, like, right after September 11th happened, people were in shock. And she tried to use what they used to call parody. You know, there used to be this thing called political satire, that when a situation gets really extreme, you make a parody of it. Now, unfortunately, Texas doesn't have a really good reputation with handling that sort of thing. There was this whole thing about this cartoon competition that happened a little bit up the ways from Dallas a couple of years ago, and it did not go very well. They did some very, very, very unspeakable things, and they don't really talk about it now. But I found an old newspaper that had the article in it, but it wasn't quite like that. It was the kind of thing that it was only allowed to be online for about 4 weeks, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. It was so disappeared that when they contacted the person who hosted the server that had it, he's like, look, it just disappeared. I'm not asking any questions. But I believe, and other people believe too, that somebody took that parody site and they started using it for these proxy ops. And it kind of laid low for about 10 years. But then at some point in time, when these things started getting activated, she was like approached about a buy-in for this sort of like clandestine ops kind of thing, and she said no. So then they went through this process where they just like ran her through the ringer. You wouldn't believe the stuff that she says they did, and I believe most of it. I believe almost all of it, actually. And she talked about happening, and she believes now that she can confirm and prove her original charges. One of her charges, I remember this very specifically because nobody talks about this anymore. Her main charge against the Clinton administration was that by doubling the prison population in the time frame they had, that it had all of these impacts on people of color and the rates of incarceration impacting other sort of things that were going on that could have provided economic opportunities to different communities. And that was one of the reasons that Tommy Thompson was listed, because the whole welfare reform thing had done this situation where a lot of people were experiencing homelessness that hadn't before. That there was this major increase in homeless women and children, where previously women and children hadn't been homeless in the same way before. That at that time, there were a lot of people that were military veterans, specifically from the Vietnam War, and they may have had some sort of substance problem or some sort of physical problem. And so that was the majority of homelessness. But then once they started implementing welfare reform, there was a very alarming increase in women and children. And she had this theory that it was part of a long-term strategy to leverage incarceration and the disadvantages that people had after they had gotten out with some sort of social engineering paradigm that was supposed to also, be connected to what was going on with welfare reform. And at the time, she had one kind of analysis. But now she understands it has to do with strategic depression of wages and this kind of artificial competition that was going on in certain sectors where people who had been in prison were put into these workforce programs, and that employers were getting incentives, including subsidies from the government, in order to hire former offenders at lower wages. And so this was actually, especially if you were homeless, creating this disadvantage if you didn't have a criminal record. And some people would say, well, this is a civil rights issue as well. And she believed that it was part of a strategic paradigm in order to compel people to accede to a normalization to other kinds of crime in order to find ways to dispossess them of their capacity to engage in exercise of their political rights. Now, she says that this substantiates other claims she has that they're actually domestic terrorists. She must be crazy.